This is the true story of January 15th, 1919. This is the story of a black, sticky tide 70 feet wide that roared through the city's north end, a catastrophe so bizarre, so unprecedented, that it literally changed the structural, legal, and engineering landscape of America forever. It was not a fire. It was not a flood. It was pure, unadulterated, weaponized molasses. The narrative begins. Boston, January 14th, 1919. The air over Boston's north end was a peculiar mixture of crisp Atlantic cold and an omnipresent heavy sweetness. This was the scent of progress, or at least the scent of the Purity Distilling Company's colossal storage tank, a looming behemoth of riveted steel that dominated the landscape near the harbor. For the residents of Commercial Street, the aroma, a sickly sweet blend of fermentation and raw cane, was simply the smell of home. They were used to it. They barely even noticed the faint rhythmic groans the metal structure emitted on particularly cold days. It was mid-January, and the city was emerging from a brutal cold snap. The day before, the temperature had hovered well below freezing. But on the 14th, a deceptive, almost spring-like warmth had begun to creep in, a dangerous, quick thaw that would prove to be the final, fatal ingredient in a disaster brewing for months. The Purity Distilling Company was not distilling much alcohol at the moment. Prohibition was looming, set to be ratified in just days, and Purity was pivoting. Their enormous tank, a monstrous cylinder 50 feet high and 90 feet in diameter, was a holding facility for industrial-grade, dark Puerto Rican molasses, a raw ingredient used to make industrial alcohol, a base for rum, and ironically, the sweetening agent that gave the city's famed Boston baked beans their distinctive kick. In the post-war industrial boom, this molasses was liquid gold. The tank itself, completed in 1915, was a monument to cheap speed and corporate negligence. When it was under construction, locals had nicknamed it the Big Black Drum, and a few more observant residents had noted the ominous leaks that had appeared almost immediately. Children in the neighborhood had a morbid yet playful ritual. They would collect the sugary syrup that weeped from the seams of the tank, molasses that ran black and thick down the sides, scooping it up for a makeshift treat. They called the trickle molasses candy. One man, however, had noticed more than just a sweet leak. Isaac Gonzalez, a watchman employed by the Public Works, had stood gazing up at the tank many times. A thoughtful, meticulous man, he had a distinct memory of watching the riveting crew when the tank was being assembled. They had been rushed, slapdash. They cut corners like a hungry dog cuts around the butcher's block. He even recalled seeing the foreman, a man named Finn, paint over obvious leaks, hoping to hide the structural failures beneath a glossy new coat of black paint. He had reported his observations to his superiors, but nothing was done. The Purity Distilling Company had powerful friends, and the tank, which held 2.3 million gallons of liquid, represented too much profit to be halted by a watchman's concern. By the evening of January 14th, the tank was full, stuffed to its steel rafters with molasses imported from the tropics. The thick liquid, having been chilled by the Boston winter, was now warming rapidly in the unseasonal temperature spike. This expansion was creating immense, almost unimaginable pressure on the tank's hastily riveted seams. Inside, the molasses was not static, it was alive. The recent shipment had been fermented, a common practice to preserve the cargo at sea. This natural fermentation produced carbon dioxide gas, which was also contributing to the internal pressure. The Big Black Drum was a pressure cooker, ticking away quietly amidst a bustling industrial neighborhood. A neighborhood on the cusp. Commercial Street was a lively artery in the heart of the North End, a dense working-class neighborhood that was the first stop for thousands of Italian and Irish immigrants. Life here was a constant bustle. tenement buildings stood shoulder to shoulder with shipping offices, stables, and factories. The city had just finished building an elevated railway structure, the Boston Elevated Railway, supported by massive steel girders and concrete pylons that ran right past the Purity tank. Below, the city's fire station, Engine 31, sat ready, its horses stabled, its men playing pinochle. Across the street was a public works building where the street sweepers gathered, and next to that, a storage area for the city's horses, mostly large, sturdy Clydesdales and workhorses, essential to the era's commerce. January 15th was supposed to be a good day. Purity Distilling was planning a major transfer of the molasses to clear space for more shipments, hoping to maximize their stock before the strictures of prohibition began to bite. It was a race against time, a final, greedy push for profit. The air smelled sweet, the sky was clear. The temperature was climbing, and the iron of the elevated railway was humming with the morning's first trains. Everything was normal until 12:30 p.m. The cataclysm, 12:30 p.m., January 15th. The moment of the collapse was a fusion of forces: mechanical stress, thermal expansion, chemical fermentation, and corporate incompetence. For those nearest, the first sensation was a sound that defied description. It was too loud, too massive to be anything made by man. Witnesses described it variously as the crack of doom, a roar like a train wreck, a drum beat, or a sound akin to a Gatling gun firing rapid-fire rivets. The truth was, it was the sound of over 2 million gallons of super-pressurized, warm molasses suddenly meeting the cold Boston air. The massive steel tank didn't just leak or split, it disintegrated. The bottom ring of the enormous cylinder tore away first, instantly followed by the side panels exploding outward in 1,000 jagged shards. The force of the rupture was not merely that of falling liquid, it was a sudden, catastrophic release of pressure. The molasses had been storing potential energy like a bomb. In the span of a single second, a wave of molasses, 25 feet high, nearly the height of a 3-story building, was born. This was no gentle liquid flow. Molasses, especially in cold weather, has a viscosity approximately 1,000 times that of water. It was a semi-solid, moving wall of black, thick matter moving with the terrifying speed of a flash flood. Initial estimates, later confirmed by engineering studies, clocked the wave's speed at roughly 35 miles per hour. The wave hit everything in its path with the concussive force of a runaway freight train. The first structure to be utterly annihilated was the headquarters of the Boston Elevated Railway, a sturdy, multi-story building. The massive wall of syrup struck it broadside, instantly shearing it from its foundation. The structure collapsed in on itself, becoming nothing more than kindling submerged in a black swamp. Inside, dozens of clerks, motormen, and engineers who were eating their lunch were crushed or drowned before they could even understand what was happening. Engine 31, the fire station, was next. The wave slammed into the brick building, twisting its doors off their hinges, flattening the brick walls and tossing the heavy fire equipment, the ladders, the pumpers, and the hoses around like toys. The impact lifted the entire brick structure off its base and deposited it 20 feet down the street. 8 firemen, men who had faced down countless infernos, were trapped and killed in a dark, sugary death. Across the street, the public works barn, which housed dozens of city workhorses, was hit. These large, powerful animals, essential to the city's commerce, had no chance. The molasses was too thick for them to swim in, too forceful to run from. They drowned almost instantly, their cries muffled by the roar of the collapsing steel and the slushing of the heavy syrup. The human toll and the sticky grip. The speed and density of the molasses meant that there was virtually no time to react. The disaster struck at 12:30 p.m., the absolute peak of the lunch hour. Workers were walking outside, children were playing in the streets, and clerks were streaming out of their offices.
One of the most tragic stories belonged to a group of teamsters,
men who drove the horse-drawn teams, who were gathered around a cart waiting for their next assignment. The wave swept them up instantly, tossing them like rag dolls. One teamster, a man named Michael Sullivan, was later found pinned against a telephone pole, his body completely encased in the hardening molasses, having died not from blunt trauma, but from asphyxiation in the thick goo. The molasses was a killer, and a confounding one. In the initial, terrifying seconds, the speed and blunt force were the chief culprits. People were instantly crushed by collapsing walls or struck by flying debris, including fragments of the 90-foot steel tank. One witness claimed to have seen a section of the tank's steel wall weighing several tons flying through the air and landing squarely on a nearby freight car, derailing it. But in the aftermath, as the temperature plummeted again and the molasses began to cool, its unique properties turned it into a lethal trap. Molasses, as it cools, becomes denser, thicker, and harder to move through. Within minutes, the vast pool of syrup, which had settled in the low-lying streets and cellars, began to set, turning into a thick, black cement. A 3-block area was now buried under up to 3 feet of this sticky, suffocating sludge. People who survived the initial wave found themselves immersed up to their waists, then their chests. Every movement to escape only sapped their strength, as the viscosity of the syrup made every step a Herculean effort. Victims were drowning in molasses, a death that was slow, arduous, and terrifyingly unique. The smell, overwhelming in the best of times, was now a noxious, cloying miasma of sugar and death. It burned the eyes, choked the throat, and coated everything. The arrival of rescue. The first responders were the sailors from the USS Nantucket, a training ship docked nearby. They saw the explosion, heard the screams, and rushed into the dark, sticky devastation. What they found was a nightmare unlike any naval disaster they had ever trained for. The sailors waded into the molasses, often sinking up to their knees, trying to pull bodies, both living and dead, from the hardening sludge. The difficulty was immense. The molasses stuck to everything, clothing, ropes, and hands, making any rescue attempt slow and frustrating. The sailors worked with a desperate frenzy, knowing that every second the molasses cooled, the harder it would be to extract the trapped victims. The sound of the rescue was a dreadful chorus of screams and the slurping, sucking sounds of the molasses as people and horses were pulled free. One sailor recounted having to tie a rope around a man's leg and having 5 men pulled for 5 minutes to extricate him from the sticky suction of the ground. When the man was finally freed, his clothing was torn off and his skin was burned and blistered by the molasses, which held the heat of the initial friction. The city's official response was chaos. Fire trucks could not navigate the molasses-coated streets. Ambulances and doctors were paralyzed. The entire ground level was a 3-foot-deep, impassable swamp of syrup. The Boston police were rushed in, but even they struggled. For 4 full days, rescue workers, police, firemen, sailors, and hundreds of local volunteers waded through the sludge, searching for survivors and recovering the dead. The final toll was horrific for such a localized freak accident. 21 people were killed and 150 were injured. But the immediate physical toll was only the beginning of the Great Boston Molasses Flood's legacy. The true impact was only starting to emerge, not just in the sticky, ruined streets, but in the courtrooms and engineering labs of America. The wave passed, but the killer remained. It wasn't water that receded, leaving behind ruin. It was a tide of sugar that congealed, trapping the dead and staining the living. The disaster was so ridiculous, a flood of molasses, that the world laughed. But in Boston, where men and horses lay buried in sweet black sludge, the laughter died. What followed was a cleanup effort of epic proportions and a legal war that would pit the grieving families of the North End against the colossal indifference of corporate America. The question wasn't if the tank exploded, but why,
and who would pay the ultimate price for 2 million gallons of deadly greed. The sweet, sticky prison, the immediate aftermath. For the rest of the day and into the night of January 15th, the North End was plunged into a surreal nightmare. The massive, black-brown pool of molasses was everywhere. It had penetrated cellars, coated the sides of buildings up to the second floor, and slicked the cobblestone streets into a treacherous, impassable surface. The temperature, after its brief, unseasonable spike, began to plummet again, nearing the freezing mark. This rapid cooling transformed the fluid disaster into a semi-solid obstacle. Rescue workers, the sailors, the police, and the civilian volunteers struggled against the molasses' increasing viscosity. Ropes meant to pull out victims snapped under the suction. Shovels were useless. The sludge was too thick to scoop, yet too soft to break apart. The smell was the constant, sickening backdrop to the tragedy. The air, already thick with the scent of fermented syrup, now carried the heavy odor of death, of 21 human victims and at least 10 workhorses suffocating beneath the dark surface. The rescuers themselves became coated head to toe in the molasses, turning them into dark, sticky figures struggling in the gloom. Their clothes hardened, restricting movement and causing a perpetual, agonizing skin irritation. The bizarre cleanup effort. The task of cleaning the North End seemed impossible. The molasses had seeped into every crack and crevice, gluing debris and bodies to the ground. City officials, desperate to restore order and commerce, had to improvise a cleanup strategy with tools not meant for this unique disaster. The solution came from a pragmatic source, the waterfront. Fire department pumpers, designed to spray water, were converted to spray salt water, drawn directly from the harbor. This was a critical insight. Salt water, due to its chemical properties, was more effective at breaking down the sticky sugars of the molasses than fresh water. For days, fire hoses rained down salt water, turning the black sludge into a lighter, less viscous brown slurry. The process was agonizingly slow and environmentally disastrous. The massive volume of molasses and salt water flowed directly into the Boston harbor, turning the water an inky brown and killing off large numbers of fish and marine life. For weeks, the harbor water carried the unmistakable, cloying scent of fermented sugar. Beyond the spraying, hundreds of city workers, now called the Molasses Brigade, were hired. They used axes, picks, and brute force to chip away at the hardening syrup. Every piece of equipment, every scrap of clothing, every brick had to be scraped clean. The elevated railway structure, the one piece of engineering that had not collapsed, was a site of bizarre devastation. Its steel girders were coated in a sticky armor, and workers had to risk slipping on the slick metal to chip away the syrup so trains could resume service. The entire area remained under molasses-fueled siege for weeks. It took over 6 months to completely remove the molasses from the side streets, the homes, and the businesses of the North End. Even a year later, on a hot summer day, residents swore they could still catch a faint, sweet whiff of the catastrophe. The birth of a legal giant, the U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company versus the people. The disaster was for a short time considered a bizarre, freak act of God, but the residents of the North End, their lives ruined and their loved ones dead, knew better. They knew the tank had leaked. They knew the construction had been shoddy. They demanded justice. The corporate giant that owned Purity Distilling, and thus the tank, was the U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company. USIA immediately denied all responsibility, suggesting that the tank must have been sabotaged by anarchists, or, more absurdly, that the initial explosion was a bomb planted by enemies of the impending prohibition. But the sheer scale of the negligence was impossible to ignore. A groundbreaking civil lawsuit was filed, a consolidated action representing 119 plaintiffs, the families of the dead and the injured, and the owners of the ruined businesses and properties, against USIA. It was one of the first major class action-style suits against a large corporation in American history.
The investigation and the rise of the expert witness. The city of Boston appointed a special auditor, Colonel Hugh W. Ogden, to oversee the investigation and trial. Ogden was a brilliant, meticulous lawyer, a man who understood that to win against money and influence of USIA, he would need undeniable, scientific facts. This requirement for irrefutable evidence led to one of the most significant and surprising aspects of the trial: the extensive use of expert witnesses and forensic engineering. This case essentially established the modern precedent for using scientific and engineering testimony in U.S. courtrooms. Colonel Ogden brought in the best minds. Professor Louis R. Ferguson, structural engineer. Ferguson's testimony was the prosecution's cornerstone. He meticulously examined the surviving fragments of the tank's steel plates. His analysis revealed devastating flaws. Steel too thin. The plates were substantially thinner than required by standard engineering practices for a tank of that height and diameter. Insufficient factor of safety. The tank was built with a safety factor of only 1.9, meaning it was only strong enough to hold 1.9 times the weight it was designed for. Modern standards require a minimum safety factor of 3 to 5 for such structures. Brittle steel. Crucially, Ferguson tested the steel and found it had a low percentage of manganese, making it brittle and vulnerable to fracture, especially in cold weather stress. The flawed blueprints. Ogden's team discovered that the tank's construction foreman had been so rushed that he skipped a basic and vital safety step: water testing. The tank had never been filled with water, a non-fermenting, non-pressurizing liquid, to check its integrity before being filled with heavy, volatile molasses. Furthermore, the blueprints themselves were found to be inadequate, displaying stresses and pressures that the steel could simply not withstand. Chemical and thermal stress. The prosecution argued, backed by chemical engineers, that the molasses itself became a lethal accelerant. The warm tropical molasses had been dumped into the cold tank, and then the unseasonal thaw and fermentation created a perfect storm of thermal and gaseous pressure. The tank was not just holding liquid, it was holding a bomb of pressurized, expanding syrup. The defense's absurdity. The anarchist plot. The U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company, recognizing the weight of the evidence, adopted a desperate strategy, maintaining their initial claim that the disaster was an act of terrorism. Their defense lawyer, a formidable corporate litigator, tried to paint the victims as targets in a plot orchestrated by Italian anarchists, a surprisingly cynical and calculated move given the North End was a predominantly Italian immigrant community. They introduced testimony suggesting that a shadowy figure had been seen near the tank just before the explosion. The absurdity of this claim was highlighted by the fact that no fragments of an explosive device were ever found, and the nature of the rupture, a shearing of the bottom ring, not an outward blast, was consistent only with internal pressure. Furthermore, a witness, the tank's painter, was brought forward to testify that he heard a noise before the explosion that sounded like a rattle of rivets, not a detonation. But the most damning evidence came from the people themselves. The testimony of the leaks. The trial lasted for 3 long years, becoming a national spectacle. It drew attention not for its sensationalism, but for its dry, relentless cataloging of negligence. Key to the verdict was the testimony of the residents, the people who had lived in the shadow of the colossal tank. They testified, one after another, about the leaks. Isaac Gonzalez, the watchman, provided his chilling account of seeing the foreman, Finn, painting over the leaks to hide them. He described seeing a crew struggling to tighten the rivets, even after the tank was partially filled. Neighborhood children testified about collecting the sweet, sticky molasses candy that permanently stained the base of the tank. A delivery man testified that his truck tires would often get stuck in the accumulating molasses at the foot of the structure. This repeated, verifiable testimony established a clear pattern of prior knowledge and willful disregard by the USIA. The corporation knew the tank was failing, and they chose to rush the job and hide the evidence for the sake of profit. In the end, Colonel Ogden and the scientific testimony prevailed. After years of litigation, the special auditor ruled definitively. The explosion was caused by structural failure due to negligence in design and construction. The anarchist theory was dismissed as baseless speculation. The U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company was found liable, and they were ordered to pay a total of $1 million, equivalent to over $17 million in today's currency, to the victims and their families. The impact of this judgment went far beyond the money. It was one of the first successful legal attempts to hold a major American corporation accountable for engineering negligence that resulted in mass casualties. The case served as a watershed moment in American legal history, setting a critical precedent for corporate liability and the use of scientific, expert evidence in civil litigation, a precursor to modern product liability and safety laws. The molasses flood, initially a local tragedy, was now a national legal landmark, forcing companies across America to reconsider the quality, safety, and legal ramifications of their industrial infrastructure. But the lessons learned were only just beginning to stick. The money was paid, the lawyers went home, and the stench eventually faded. But the sticky death on Commercial Street left an invisible, indelible stain on the American industrial landscape. The trial was over, but the work of preventing the next molasses flood or the next catastrophic infrastructure failure was just beginning. From the wreckage of that exploded steel drum rose a silent, profound revolution in how America built its cities, enforced its safety, and held its powerful corporations accountable. The bizarre tragedy in Boston became the blueprint for the modern age of engineering responsibility. The institutional reckoning, a new era of building codes. The successful litigation against the U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA, proved one critical fact. Corporate negligence could be proven by scientific evidence. The ruling that the tank failed due to inadequate design and construction, not an external force, forced American cities and states to confront the terrifying lack of oversight that existed for industrial infrastructure. Prior to 1919, in many parts of the country, industrial tanks, bridges, and boilers were often constructed with minimal or no government oversight. Building codes primarily focused on residential and commercial structures, like ensuring fire escapes or appropriate window sizes for tenements. Industrial vessels seen as private company property were left almost entirely to the discretion of their owners and builders. The molasses flood changed this paradigm overnight.
Material testing and certification. The brittle steel that Ferguson's forensic analysis identified became a key focus. New codes required certified steel compositions, specifically mandating the correct inclusion of elements like manganese to ensure ductility and prevent catastrophic cold weather fracture. Mandatory pressure testing, the water test. The simple, skipped step that could have prevented the entire disaster became a legal requirement. No large tank could be placed into service until it had been filled with water, allowing inspectors to check its structural integrity and discover leaks before it was filled with potentially volatile or valuable commercial products. This shift was a quiet revolution. It moved industrial construction from an era of self-regulation and gentlemen's agreements into an age of statutory engineering oversight. The Boston Molasses flood is still taught in engineering schools today as a foundational case study in the crucial importance of structural safety margins and material science. The psychological and urban legacy. The molasses flood left a permanent scar on the North End, a working-class community forever marked by a disaster that was both tragic and, bizarrely, faintly comedic to the outside world. The lasting stain. The neighborhood never fully shook the memory or the faint, residual scent. For decades, locals recounted tales of walking down the street on a hot summer day and noticing the pervasive, cloying smell rising from the pavement and cellars. Molasses that had seeped so deeply into the earth and the foundations that it literally took years to fully decompose. The phrase, the molasses flood, entered the local vernacular as a shorthand for colossal, absurd, and preventable failure. Infrastructure reevaluation. The sheer power of the molasses wave forced city planners to reconsider the placement of essential infrastructure near major industrial sites. The fact that the fire station, a key responder, was instantly incapacitated was a glaring failure. Future city planning began to incorporate safety buffers and redundancy for critical services located near high-risk industrial facilities. Perhaps the most tangible and lasting reminder, beyond the stories, is the architecture itself. The elevated railway which survived the impact had its supports reinforced and its structure reviewed. When Boston ultimately decided to tear down the L in the 1950s, part of a massive urban renewal project known as the Central Artery, the area where the tank stood was heavily re-engineered, with the land excavated to ensure no residual contamination or instability remained. Today, the site of the Great Tank is a simple, pleasant waterside park, a quiet tribute to the chaos that once reigned there. The unseen influence on American law. The legal victory in the molasses flood case was arguably the most historically impactful outcome. It forged a new path for holding corporations accountable, one based on tort law and expert testimony. Before this trial, common law often favored industrial enterprises, which could easily deflect blame onto workers, or contributory negligence, or external forces, like act of God. The sheer, unarguable scientific evidence of the tank's failure, coupled with the testimony of ignored warnings, the leaks, allowed Colonel Ogden to establish the core legal tenet. The USIA had a duty of care to the public, and they breached that duty through substandard construction, directly causing the resulting deaths and destruction. This landmark decision laid the intellectual groundwork for modern product liability law. It set the precedent that a company is responsible for catastrophic failures resulting from flaws in the design or manufacture of its structures and products, regardless of the user's interaction. The power of the expert witness. The use of forensic engineers and chemists to dissect a disaster and provide empirical data to a jury became the de jure standard in American civil courts. The victims of the molasses flood, the immigrants and working-class families of the North End, had taken on one of the most powerful corporations in America and won, not through political maneuvering or sensationalism, but through the sober application of scientific and engineering principles. Conclusion: the sticky truth. The Great Boston Molasses Flood remains one of the strangest and most surprising true stories in American history. It was a killer that defied logic, a disaster that smelled like candy, and a wave that moved with the density of stone. 21 lives were lost in minutes, victims of a greedy rush to beat prohibition and a catastrophic failure of engineering. But from the sticky ruins of Commercial Street, a massive change was forged. The tragedy served as an essential, horrifying lesson. Profit cannot come at the expense of human life, and basic engineering must be treated as a public trust. The next time a massive steel tank is built in an American city, the next time a structural engineer checks their calculations, and the next time a lawyer marshals a scientific expert in court, they are, consciously or not, standing on ground zero of the Great Boston Molasses Flood. They are following the standards written in the aftermath of a bizarre black tide that briefly drowned a section of an American city in sugar, leaving behind not just death and devastation, but an enduring, essential legacy of safety.